It just occurred to me that I believe that the year 0 begins with the birth of Jesus Christ, but does it begin with the death? When does the 0
AD after death?
AD is so it's after death. Because I thought it was Anno Domini, which I was like, is a little ambiguous.
Wait a minute, 1 AD is birth, right?
That's the question. I'm glad that this isn't a dumb question.
No, 1 AD is birth, not death, not crucifixion.
Okay, hold on. And year of the Lord. Yep. First year. I was always taught after death.
Ask the Jew. Ask the Jew.
I know. Absolutely.
But what I recently learned from the gentleman that we just discussed is that actually, apparently, the dating of 180 doesn't really even make sense at all. Like, obviously, it's not historically salient, but the historian, the Christian theologian who developed the chronology, it was like 300 years later or something like that. I might be wrong, but by their own, but by the internal accounting of the Gospels, it doesn't make sense. His accounting doesn't make sense. Something with Herod's time in office, but that's a different matter. But I think it's theoretically it honors the birth of Jesus, right? That's why.
I wasn't sure because I was like, the first, I assume 15 years of Jesus's life are, I assume, pretty non-eventful.
33.
No, but I'm saying maybe when he turned 15, things started becoming more interesting. That's I was just assuming, but I mean,
I don't know. David, at what point
does Jesus become interesting?
Does it just become interesting? Like, at what point do you understand his role and place in the universe become essential to him as a person?
You mean when does Jesus become sort of in the world a prominent person?
Because he's born and then he kind of exits stage left for a bit, right? And then I assume he enters.
It's the Apostle Paul. So a lot of people, there was a time period where people used to put Paul as a more prominent historical figure than Jesus, which I think is ridiculous. But essentially the argument was that Jesus left behind, even if you believe in everything, the resurrection account and everything, that he left behind a group of people that numbered no more than like 100, that there was no movement he left behind at all. And that was actually created and triggered by Paul more than anybody else. His missionary journeys all around the Mediterranean.
And he expands
all around the Mediterranean basin.
He expands the gospel from a covenantal relationship with the Jewish people to a universal mission, right?
He was the one who, more than anyone, who took the gospel outside of Judaism. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in that sense, it's hard to argue that you can say that spiritually, Jesus is the most important character, but in terms of political propagation, Paul's contribution changed the world probably, by a secular historian's perspective, the most.
Right, but then But then in his telling, then, at what age is Jesus active?
No. So I think the idea from Vanessa's original question was actually wondering, like, if you understand Jesus as a person in his 33 years of life on this earth, what point in his life do we traditionally understand him to become politically, religiously active? Because there's no understanding in which he is born with the consciousness of the Son of God, right? In all accounting, it becomes something that he awakens into. No. Or am I wrong?
I don't think that, the earliest accounts of sort of childhood Jesus are when he goes to the temple and he sort of lectures the teachers of the law. And I think a lot of the assumption at that time is he already kind of knew who he was. But I don't think there's any doubt that he had to come into that. In other words, he's not sitting there at 2 years old, conscious of his divinity, as I don't think how theologians would describe it.
Right. But there was no consensus about at what point that...
It wasn't like he turned 13 and it was like now...
Right, at his bar mitzvah, he realized his role.
It's like at bar mitzvah, he's like, wait, what? I'm the Son of God? No. Yeah. No, that's not it.
Okay, hey, Vanessa.
Hey, Adam.
Today we have David French joining us on Uncertain Things to talk about, so the original reason I wanted to bring you here, and this is the primary source of the conversation, is the growing place of religion in the political discourse in a way that I don't know if we would agree that we would accept as like real religious, but I would say my sense is that there is a lot of ersatz religiosity being thrusted into the political discourse in ways that I found interesting to talk with you about. So thank you for joining. It's been a while.
So glad to be here. It's been a minute, but it's great to be with you.
But I think before we go into the fun religious stuff, I have to ask you, on your nuclear clock of civil war, where are we? Are we 5 minutes to 12?
So I have to do two different clocks. There's a Civil War clock, which I think is way away from it, and a dissolution clock that I think is a lot closer, because the
dissolution of the Union, you mean?
Of the Union. So my book I wrote in 2020 was about the possibility of American disunion, rooted in the idea, which I think is completely still valid in the year of our Lord 2025, that
2026?
I'm sorry, 2026. Yes,
Yeah.
2026.
Updated.
That there's no truly important cultural, political, religious, social movement that's pulling us together more than is driving us apart. Like all the tectonic forces are pushing us apart. And I think that's as true in 2026 as it was in 2020. I think it's more true in 2026 than it was in 2020. But my thesis was also that, this is going to sound strange, we almost hate each other too much to actually fight a civil war. And by that I mean, if you really hate somebody, you might be amenable to a divorce. And so the question would be, if some set of states decided to separate themselves from the Union, would we really mobilize to fight to bring them back? Or would everyone just be flipping each other the bird out the door as they, as like mom and dad separate, right? And so my view is that we're much less likely to fight an actual war as we would be to have what you might call a messy, violent divorce. But nothing like the Battle of Gettysburg again.
Right. But I mean, I'm not as politically up to date as you two, because I know that's like your beat. So I watch politics as like a lazy spectator, dropping in every now and then and going, oh no, and then coming back. But is it, from the vague grumblings I'm hearing, isn't Trump kind of making motions towards Greenland? And the undercurrent of that in my mind is like, we must be large, we must be big, we must be bigger. And therefore, if some states got a little wandery, if it were under a Trump era, that he would probably not take kindly to that.
That's a great point. If Mamdani and Hochul decide to separate, won't he just kidnap Mamdani or something?
So the question, for example, I think, and I marked out some scenarios, and I wrote about some scenarios in the book. The reason why I don't think we would have a civil war isn't so much because a president wouldn't necessarily want it, but rather because I don't think the military would fight it. So that's the big difference here. So if you go back to the Civil War, what you had was a microscopic military by modern standards, just tiny, in a very different nation, in a very different culture. And so then when the southern states seceded, you sort of had this very small professional army, and the officers kind of chose amongst themselves where they were going to go. Robert E. Lee made his own decision. George Thomas, a Virginian, made a different decision. Stonewall Jackson of Virginia went with the same direction as Robert E. Lee. But to actually fight the war, both the Confederacy and the Union basically created armies from scratch. The Union Army was a new deal. The Confederate Army was a new deal. And it's interesting, if you talk to military historians about it, they will talk about how the Europeans, sort of who are watching the American Civil War from a distance, thought the early battles and some of the early conflicts between the Union and the Confederacy were just amateurish. Like it was just a bunch of amateurs. We don't think of that because we look at these Civil War leaders and we think great generals, right? And some of them were. But early on, America was not the kind of nation it is now with this vast standing army. So you really genuinely created military forces that went to war with each other. I think in this situation, what you would have is let's say you have an order given to the 101st Airborne to invade Los Angeles. Um, that's going to create a lot of issues. It's going to create a lot of issues. And I'm not certain that you would have the kind of unanimous military support for large scale military activity against other people, for example, that members of the 101st Airborne have trained with and fought with. Now, of course, that did happen at a much smaller scale with some of the officers who led the Army, led the Confederacy, and led the Union. They had served together in the Mexican-American War. But again, that was this tiny professional officer corps that existed in a very different nation, where it was an open question in 1861 whether you were primarily a citizen of a state or primarily a citizen of a nation. So it was an open question whether somebody would choose to go with their state or to go with their country. Here, I don't think it's so much state versus country. I think what we have is is the incredible personal division that is occurring all around this country. And it's very hard for me to see the military that I know and that I've been a part of as tearing itself apart to such an extent that it would go to war with each other. That's the thing that I just have a real problem imagining.
My alternative scenario that I can imagine starts with a similar perspective, the idea that we hate each other too much to go to war. Because I was reading recently about some of the relationships that existed during the Civil War in South and North, because almost every prominent family had relatives on the other side. So that was, I was even asking myself, is this where the original idea of you don't talk politics on the over the dinner table started from? Because I remember there was a specific story about the Roosevelts sitting, they had like the family was divided between the two sides, so they would never address that topic, like, because they needed to show love to the full family and understand that people made their choices, while obviously people feeling very strongly and about their positions, but also not wanting to see relatives die. They were in a painful situation, and they really felt the horror of what a civil war means. Whereas now, without being in a real civil war, you get people fantasizing constantly about the destruction, humiliation, and suffering of their political enemies. Sometimes when those political enemies are in their family, they will say, like, well, you had it coming. You supported the wrong guy, right? That we were seeing real relationships being torn apart because there's an expectation of alignment, and if you're not with me, I am going to relish in your suffering. This is being injected more and more into our politics, the desire to see somebody suffer. Now, on one hand, that makes your theory reasonable, that we hate each other too much to actually go to war to stay together. That why? Just separate, just take New York and go. On the other hand, the underlying desire to see the other side suffer might might energize people to pick up guns and bring this harm on the other side, right? Oh, you've given me the excuse by seceding. Now I have the permission structure to arm myself and massacre the libs, or massacre the maggots, fight against ICE. And we're seeing that tinges of this already happening now in Minnesota, right? You're seeing that bloodlust on both sides.
Yes, but civil war isn't just bloodlust, it's organized bloodlust at scale. So, what we have in America is a large number of radicalized citizens, some very small militias by historic standards, just tiny, very small. The organized violence of the United States is in its all volunteer, highly professional military. And it is, and that military in many ways is a culture all unto itself. It is part of America and it is not at the same time. And this is something that actually a lot of people have identified as sort of an issue with decade after decade of an all-volunteer military, that you do create a kind of parallel structure in society, one that is got its own culture, it's got its own ethos. It's just a different thing from American civilian life. And a lot of people have sort of talked about that as they could imagine a situation in which the creation of sort of a warrior caste could be a long-term threat to democracy, in the sense that eventually you create something like a Praetorian Guard. But given the culture of the military, I found that to be highly unlikely. You could change the culture of the military and have a Praetorian Guard, but given the current culture of the military, I think that's very hard. And so what you have is a lot of highly radicalized citizens who are not in the military, almost zero highly radicalized citizens that are in the military, and a military ethos and culture that is where this kind of conflict would be an anathema, just an absolute anathema. And so a U.S. military would be much more likely, I think, to just sit on the sidelines and sort itself out after it.
But the military can sit on the sidelines while other organizations, I'm not necessarily civilian militias, but there are other institutions in the different layers of U.S. government that have legal access to arms. You were talking about the Praetorian Guard. I'm thinking about the 2020 stories about the what do you call it? The secret security services around Trump.
Secret Service.
Yeah.
The Secret Service. The stories about the Secret Service around Trump, right, where the loyalty goes to the president. That is the Secret Service is set up as a Praetorian Guard, and then you have the local police forces, and then you have organizations like ICE that have their own culture and their own stakes in the culture war.
Yeah, I think all of that makes this messy and violent, but we're still not talking anything within shouting distance of the Battle of Gettysburg. Like, just not even in shouting distance. You know, what you're talking about is something like a low-grade insurgency or some street violence. I think something like that would absolutely happen if you had kind of dissolution. But the idea where you have, when I'm talking about civil war, I'm thinking about the 101st Airborne. I'm talking about the 1st Marine Division. I'm talking about creating military formations and going to fight each other, like in the Spanish Civil War, the American Civil War. You know, when you had the worst days of the Iraqi Civil War, you had these militias were large, organized paramilitary/military forces. And I think that you could only have the kind of civil war that came out of Iraq only after you had disbanded the whole military. The whole military of Iraq had been disbanded. And so then you have all these hundreds of thousands of armed, trained men just kind of dumped into the body politic, right? And so in this situation, it's just very difficult for me to see a situation where you would have the military with its current culture, its current command structure, its current ethos, its current legal scenario, deploying against each other to fight pitched battles.
So just to understand then, if California said it was going to succeed and Trump said, no, you're not, and sent in the military, you don't think the military would acquiesce with that?
It all depends on the situation. It depends on the situation. If California said, we're going to secede, and Trump said, arrest the governor.
Right.
I think the FBI would go and do it.
Mm-hmm.
The FBI would go and do it. Now, if it said California is going to secede and he said 82nd Airborne invade California, I don't think the 82nd Airborne does it.
Interesting.
So it's a difference in scale. Because
who has the authority to make that call? Is it like one person at the top of the military?
No, I just don't. The problem that you have is that a lot of this, if you go to military, an actual officer, it's so unthinkable. What does it mean to invade? When you want to invade, when the United States invades a place, do you have any idea how much we pound the hell out of it before we go in, typically? Or if we go in, the sheer amount of force that we use to do this. Like, a lot of people looked at the opening hours of the invasion of Ukraine and said, whoa, shock and awe. And I was like, something's off. Something's off. He thinks this is going to be a cakewalk. because he hasn't unleashed. He didn't unleash at the very beginning of that invasion. If you look at the comparison between how we softened up Saddam Hussein's forces before the Gulf War versus what he did to try to soften up Ukrainian forces before the invasion of Ukraine, it's a night and day difference. Now, we were able to be a much more lightning strike in the second Iraq war, but that was after the Iraqi army had already been heavily degraded. We had been engaging in bombing campaigns across southern Iraq for years. And so just again, a very, very different situation. So, I mean, it's, look, I mean, 15 years from now, you could be podcasting from the ruins of Manhattan and I could be responding from the ruins of Chicago. And I'd say, man, that take aged poorly, but I feel pretty strongly confident that the United States military would not mobilize against itself in the way that would be necessary to create the kind of conflict that would be an actual civil war. Because again, if the situation is like Gavin Newsom wants to secede and the American president arrests him right away and puts some troops on the ground in Sacramento and New York, or I'm sorry, in San Francisco and LA, that's not a civil war. That's just invoking the Insurrection Act and for essentially a law enforcement action. But if you're saying,
I just want to be clear. I want to be clear that your optimistic vision is not. It's going to be a peaceful dissolution. It's just not going to be quite as horrendous as a war, living up to the full potential of destruction.
I don't think this is going to happen on any front. But what I'm saying is we're risking it. We're risking it by the way we're doing our politics. So if you had said to me 25 years ago, is there any chance of American dissolution? I would say only in the most theoretical sense, in the same way that there's a chance a meteor could hit the Earth. Given enough time, over many years, a meteor is going to hit. So if you give me an indefinite future, would we dissolve as a union? I would say maybe, probably. How many countries last intact for 1,000 years? Say not very many. But if you're going to say any time in our lifetime, would we worry about dissolution in the United States? I would think you've lost your mind. However, in the current era, I'm like, I have a very different view. It's just that we're playing with fire. I still think the bonds that hold us together are really strong. They're really strong. But at the same time, we're doing about everything we can to test those bonds. And if you think you can do that, and that because we're in America, but we won't break our country because we Americans are special or unique or exceptional. No, we're the same human clay as everybody else. And so if you saw overseas, for example, let's imagine you had Macron's, I don't think he's not running for re-election. Let's suppose you have the next French presidential election and Marine Le Pen wins it and the opposition decides that's intolerable and storms government buildings in France. You would say France is unstable. You'd say that. Or if people stormed the Parliament building, you'd say the UK is unstable. Well, people stormed the American Capitol. And the logical thing to say about that is we're not that stable. If people can storm the Capitol, we have inherent instability. And so that the situation I'm saying is I don't think we're going to dissolve. But at the same time, we've got a lot of reckless conflict entrepreneurs and reckless politicians who are treating this country as if it's a permanent structure that they can pour all of their malice and hatred and division and spite into. And what they'll get out of it is they get to win and rule, versus if you pour enough hatred and malice and spite into any institution, a lot of times you don't get to rule it, you just destroy it. And I think that that's what we risk doing. Now, destroy it up to the point where we have the 101st Airborne and 82nd Airborne engaging in a battle in somewhere in eastern Kentucky. No, I think that's highly unlikely. Destroy it to the extent to where you have secessionist movements and chaos and perhaps even a breakaway state or two. I could see that. I could imagine that. And so, you have an actual California independence movement, and it pops up when Donald Trump's in the Oval Office. You have a Texas independence movement. It pops up, it popped up when Joe Biden won. And these things, which used to be stupid larks that people were on, now you say it's still stupid, but it's not a lark anymore.
I
Well,
mean,
But I don't know
if
that you wanted to talk about potential civil war the whole time.
No, but it was
Not
fascinating.
really.
We
But
can.
it's still interesting. I did have a bit of a tangent question, but I don't want to. I know we have limited time with David,
Yeah.
so I don't know if you want to
Well,
pivot us Dom already.
As a tangent. And
Okay, little bit of a tangent, David. Don't take too long on it. But I'm just curious,
okay.
given the way
Tangents are
that
fun.
you that you analyzed the kind of military due diligence that we did upon invading, how does the how do you analyze the military operation in Venezuela, and does that give you any indication of what we're laying a groundwork for?
Yeah, it's a brilliant military operation to seize a single person. It is totally inadequate as a military operation to run a country. And so, one of the things that is interesting about Trump, and we now have 5 years of him in the Oval Office. And in that 5 years, one thing that we know about Trump and one thing that we know about the way that Trump handles the military is it's not that he's in any way anything like remotely like a pacifist. I mean, the dude will drop bombs, right? He will launch special forces raids with regularity. He will even take military risks. So, for example, killing Soleimani or bombing Iranian nuclear facilities. But what he really likes to do is do a big, spectacular attack, call it a day, and then move on, right? Now, that can work sometimes. If the whole goal of your military operation is to kill Soleimani, you killed Soleimani. You don't have to do more than that. If the whole goal of your military operation is to destroy a particular Iranian facility, you can accomplish that. But if your goal is to run a country, that one precise attack, as brilliant as it was, and it was brilliant, isn't sufficient. And if your goal is to completely end a nuclear program, for example, that one attack, as devastating as it may have been, is not sufficient. So you always have to ask, have you matched ends and means with your military activity? And so given the ambition that Trump has around Venezuela, which is not as ambitious as Bush was with Iraq, but his ambition with Venezuela is essentially we're going to just kind of dictate terms to you from afar. And we're going to dictate that you revamp your oil producing economy in our favor. That military action that he's engaged in is inadequate for that purpose. And so I think what you will end up having is a situation where Venezuelans play a double game because he hasn't changed the regime.
Right.
He's just replaced which members of the regime are in power. But it's like deposing
And
Saddam
not even that
Hussein.
many, as from what I can understand.
I mean, many of the worst are still right there. It's like saying mission accomplished if you killed Saddam. And that if you remember the very opening of Operation Iraqi Freedom, there was a kind of a volley of missile fire. And there had been some thought that we might have been able to decapitate the regime like right there on day one and then change everything. But if we had decapitated the regime in Iraq and then Uday or Qusay Hussein comes into power, we wouldn't be saying Iraqi freedom, right? No. So what you have is the same regime with many of its most thuggish elements still in charge, and they know that Donald Trump is term limited, and they know they're not, okay? So what does this mean? All they have to do in their mind is survive the next bit of the Trump presidency. So that means double game. Appease Trump, whip up but maintain a certain face and posture to your local public to indicate you're still large and in charge. It's just, it's quite possible that you could have a situation where Trump gets some of what he wants. But as far as a permanent adjustment of Venezuelan governance in American favor, I think this will ultimately be counterproductive.
Well, We'll leave the broader geopolitical discussion for another time, even though
Yes.
I have
But
thought.
it was interesting, though.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, it's one of my favorite topics. Okay,
Yes.
but we've conjured you today, David, to discuss religion. So the podcast was started in 2020 with a conversation with Tom Holland about Dominion, and
Yes.
about Rome and Dominion, but also Dominion. Dominion just came out. I was
Adam, remember to talk into your mic.
sorry, Dominion had just come out, but I was a fan of Tom Holland's writing about Rome and the ancient world for years, so that was an excuse. But it really set the tone for uncertain things, and I think it was part of the zeitgeist of 2020, and recognizing how the now, it's a cliche to say, but the crisis of meaning of the Western world and especially the American public is causing some kind of religious turn. And the talk about the term religious term even is one of those academic terms that has been used since the 90s in French literature about the rediscovery of Catholicism to fill a void in the European soul. So it's not a new observation that the secular world has left people wanting, and that there's always a rediscovery of the elemental tools that a society has, a culture has, for those basic answers, social structures, and deeper sense of meaning and purpose that people desire. So it's always something that I felt ambivalently about, because I don't like the idea of turning to religion just because you feel empty. It feels like the same. I've just had this conversation about people who bring children into the world because they feel like something is missing from their lives. I don't think I don't like that idea of you want children. It's great, but because of the selfish reason of filling in your void, you're turning into that. I feel like that's the lazy excuse. You're looking for a ready-made answer for the part of your life that you need to work at. The absence of meaning is something that you constantly need to work at, rather than think that you can just buy in a prepackaged answer, whether in the form of a baby or a religion. But it was an interesting discussion, and Tom Holland's own journey of tracing back the origins of Christianity, the way that the entirety of the Western world order can be traced back to the idea of sacrifice in Jesus's story is fascinating. Now, 2025 to 2026, and the place of religion in the American discourse, I feel, has gained a new tint, not merely because attendance in traditional churches is still declining, and yet politically and publicly and visibly, religion is making a very aggressive comeback. And it seems to me, and you correct me if I'm wrong in my vibe gauging, that there is a lot more, I don't want to say just performative, but there's a lot more of a presentation of religion with or without an association with the values and the history and the tradition, because it becomes more of an identity status symbol or political claim than it is a real spiritual. And Instagram, I love that. It's an Instagram filter rather than an engagement.
So a lot there. Okay, so let me do America first, and then I'll do sort of Western civilization next, and then 4 hours later we'll talk about something else. But anyway, so here's America first. So when we talk about American exceptionalism, a lot of people talk about that in the terms of America as the greatest. I don't think of it like that. I think of it as America is different. America is unique. And there are a lot of things that make America unique. We're a continent-sized, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy. We do not have a kind of blood and soil origin story that a lot of the Western European nations have. We have much more of a creedal origin story. All of this makes us different. But here's one thing that makes us different. We're a really religious society. We always have been. America is very religious. And America is very religious, not just It's very religious in a specific way. Americans are very tempted by fundamentalism. And so if you go, and part of this is related to our origin story, like we're a whole bunch of ordinary people who left one place, often because we were pissed, and then went somewhere else, right, to do things the right way. So that means there's just kind of a lot of zeal that's like right ticking in the heart of the American, of the American body politic, just tons of zeal. More zeal often than in many of our peer countries. Why? Because maybe a lot of the most zealous people in those peer countries years ago went over here. What does this mean? America's more violent. America's a much more violent place. Let's even remove gun deaths. I mean, we're way off the charts from any Western European country on gun deaths. But in any given year, we'll have there are more deaths from people beating each other to death with their fists than there are gun deaths in entire European countries. Way more stabbing deaths, say, for example, than there are murders of all kinds in European countries. So we're a much more violent country. We're a much more zealous country. And when we're a much more religious country. And so when that comes into play, what we are is as a people, we are prone to fundamentalism. Now, what I would argue is that is the constant. Its attachment to religion is often more the variable. But because we're so freaking religious, we will take our fundamentalism in other areas and make it religious. So, for example, we're in a time of declining church attendance, declining religious activity. But do you think we're in a time of declining zeal? No. So what has happened is a lot of people have transferred to that zeal from religion qua religion to politics. But because very few people are willing to say, well, yeah, what's your religion? Oh, I'm a Democrat. That's nobody wants to admit politics is their religion, but it is. So what they then do is they kind of spiritualize their politics, but the politics is still the main thing. So taking the community I know probably better than any other, the white evangelical community. It was around 80% 80% Republican when the Republican Party was formerly pro-life. It's still 80% Republican when the Republican Party has forsaken its pro-life platform. It was about 80% Republican when the Republican Party was very intentionally in support of, traditional definition of marriage and maybe even a marriage amendment to the Constitution. It's still 80% Republican when that's not even mentioned, not even an issue, right? It's 80% Republican when the Republican Party is very interventionist, like under Bush or Reagan. It's 80% Republican when the Republican Party is very isolationist. So I often, when I try to figure out what's their deepest core of a person, what's their core affiliation, I look for what are the variables and what are the constants. When you go to the constants, that's where you find the real heart of a person. The variables, those are the things, or in other words, think of it as a planet and moons. Who orbits whom, or what orbits what? And I think that what you found with a lot of people is they're wedded to a particular kind of partisan politics, come what may. And that therefore what then happens is because we human beings don't want to say, well, my faith is my ideology. What you then say is, my faith gives me my ideology. But then when the ideology changes a ton, but your partisan affiliation remains, well, what's the constant? Like, what is the thing that is the most important? And so I think that that's one of the things that we're dealing with, really. I wrote a piece about this years ago at the height of all the 2020 stuff, at peak woke, cancellations, riots, all of this. I said, America's in the middle of a fundamentalist revival. It's just not Christian. It's political. And so I think, one of the antidotes, and a lot of people then say, well, the antidote to religion is atheism. But I don't know about you, but I've met some fundamentalist atheists in my life. People they just transfer their zeal into the absence of faith, not into the presence of faith. So they're still fundamentalist. They're just atheistic fundamentalists, but they behave very similar to any other kind of fundamentalist. So my view of it is, it's not that religion is really becoming that it's religion that is really driving us. It's fanaticism. And in America, and it's fundamentalism, it's fanaticism. And it's something we've had a problem with in America forever and ever. And all cultures deal with it to some degree, but that's what I think we're dealing with.
And I just wanted to clarify, when you're saying fundamentalism, you're saying synonymous with fanaticism. So it's like an extreme attachment to something. Is that how you're kind of defining fundamentalism?
So here's the way I remember years ago, I was talking to Richard Land, a very prominent Southern Baptist and the former head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he said, the most important thing to understand is that fundamentalism is not a theology. It is not an ideology. It is a psychology. And so that's why you have competing fundamentalists within Islam, competing fundamentalists within Judaism, competing fundamentalists within Christianity, Buddhism, Hindu. You go down the line. You have people who are exceedingly fundamentalist who have no religion at all. It's a psychology of absolute certainty, ferocity, and group solidarity. And so, but the cardinal characteristic of fundamentalism is certainty. It is, I know that I am correct. And that certainty is sort of like, in the legal system, we talk about a concept called the fruit of the poisonous tree. Adam has heard this from countless advisory opinions episodes, but the fruit of the poisonous tree. Well, what is the poisonous tree of fundamentalism? It's certainty, and that certainty bears bitter fruit. So, for example, if I'm certain that I'm right and I'm certain that you're wrong, there's only a couple of things that explain you: ignorance, malice. And so, one of the ways you can...
Or demonic intervention.
Demonic intervention, even worse. That's kind of like the ultimate malice, right? So that explains why fundamentalists are often so cruel when you interact with them, because you're just wrong. They don't think you're wrong. They don't suspect you're wrong. They know you're wrong. And so they're walking into the conversation dealing with wrongness. And whereas somebody who is not a fundamentalist, it's not that you don't have convictions. It's just you realize your own fallibility. So you walk into a conversation much more in a spirit of curiosity than you do into when you're dealing with a fundamentalist. In that circumstance, they're always walking in with conviction, very little curiosity. And fundamentalism is just a bad fit for human beings because guess what? We're all wrong a lot. Like, we're all wrong so much.
Remember the audio of Father Coughlin that I listened to, one of those famous speeches where he calls on the Jews whether they love their neighbors. And, love thy neighbor, obviously, is one of the most profound and radical ideas in Christianity, and arguably in Judaism as well, in Hillelish Judaism as well. But certainly, this is one of the deep universal radical statements of Christianity. And he says this is, because I believe in Christ, I believe in love thy neighbor, and I call upon the Jews, every Jew here, to say whether they love their neighbor, whether they agree with this. And
you shall love your neighbor or die.
Yes, the dripping ruthlessness and cruelty and as you say, the zeal that was coming out of this. It was so fascinating. And I call upon every Jew to tell me whether they love their neighbor.
So let me help with the distinction here. So, both Old Testament and New Testament, because most Christian theologians, and I don't consider myself a Christian theologian. I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but most Christian theologians would say that Jesus was and Jesus said this himself, I'm fulfilling the law. So in other words, he's not departing from it, that this forgiveness, love, Hosea 6:6 says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. In other words, the heart of love towards another human being is more important than the rituals of the religion. Micah 6:8 says, what does the Lord require of you, O man? What is good? To act justly. So that's the instrument of justice, but also to love kindness and to walk humbly before the Lord your God. So these are all Old Testament pre-Christian notions of compassion and love that is tempering all of your zeal, right? So then along comes Jesus, and Jesus says, okay, what this really fully means is you got to love your neighbor. You got to bless those who persecute you, to really dive into that. And so I don't look at Christianity as revolutionary from Judaism so much as evolutionary from Judaism. And I think often a lot of Christians feel that same way, which would be a great conversation with y'all as to, is anyone in Judaism feel that way about Christianity,
Oh,
which would be an interesting,
but by the way, I think
very,
it's that is absolutely true. That and many Jews see it that way. And but this also goes into what do you see as the core of Christianity, and what do you see the core of Judaism? I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the famous Rabbi Hillel story of the student coming to him and asking them, can you describe the Torah on one leg? Like, what is your top line for the entire Torah? And he says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," and you love thy neighbor as yourself. So this
right.
is, I had a conversation with ancient historians about what does he understand as the affiliation of Jesus in the Judean civil war of the time, and the Pharisees, which I see as in many ways the forerunners of modern Judaism. The Pharisee tradition, which is the more Talmudic rabbinical tradition, is depicted often as the villains of the New Testament. And I think that is very much the product of the internal civil war between Judeans about what it meant to be Jews. As I call it, it was like a war of Jews against Jews about what it means to be a Jew, right? That is that period in Roman occupied Judea. But Jesus also has a lot of pharisaical tendencies himself. He's very rabbinical. If you actually apply the Jewish lens, he is very rabbinical. He's very much Talmudic in his argument. So having that strain of Rabbi Hillel in his writing is very much, or his writing, his statements, his preaching, checks out. I don't understand how that fits in with the amount of loathing that the Gospels seem to have towards the Pharisees, but also maybe it is the sort of narcissism of small differences between the two. So I don't know how to draw that line, but that's my contribution to this theological discussion. But
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, it was one thing that I on this point of religion versus or spirit. I don't know how we want to talk about it in evangelical Christianity. I try to draw a distinction between traditional evangelicals and fundamentalists, even though sort of the wider world conflates the two. But I would say if you want a good definition of how to spot a fundamentalist, there's actually one that's pretty biblical, and that's in Galatians 5. It's a Pauline epistle, and it sets up sort of two contrasting visions of what are the signs when the Holy Spirit is working through you, the Spirit of the living God is working through you, versus what are the signs when you are lost, when it's the works of the flesh. And the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are not words that describe fundamentalists typically. Very little kindness, very little patience, very little joy, a lot of anger. But what is it? What are the acts of the flesh? Now, there's the moral things like sexual immorality, debauchery, idolatry, but also hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy. All of these things you see that stuff all through fundamentalist communities, just absolutely all through fundamentalist communities, that kind of jealousy, that rage, that selfish ambition, factional thinking, all of that. And so the way I think about it is when people talk to me about religion, I think of religion as simultaneously the most dangerous and the most beneficial force on earth. When a religion goes badly, it is dangerous at a level that can slaughter people by the millions. When religion goes right, it provides redemption, meaning, joy, love, humility, compassion at a level that's you can scarcely imagine. And so, one of the things that to me is so wonderful about the person of Jesus Christ is that he's so keenly aware of the danger of religion that he's constantly emphasizing the upside down nature of the religious world he's trying to build. The last shall be first. You don't hate your enemies, you love your enemies. If someone strikes you, you turn the other cheek. If someone demands your coat, you give them your cloak also. This is completely opposite. And then he goes to the cross, and then he says to you, he does not say, I go to the cross so that you will dominate. He says to Christians, take up your cross. And the cross is the ultimate example, not of seizing power, but of laying down your life in response to power. And so I think that, one of the things about religion is when people say things like Americans need to be more religious, I'm like, time out. Let's get more precise. Let's get more specific here. Because I can imagine a more religious that is dark. And I can imagine a more religious that is very light, that is bright. And I've just seen them both.
I want to add to this, if we're exchanging sermons,
which is the best kind of podcast. It's just like serial sermonizing. So we need to get everybody in.
Sermon correspondence.
Yeah.
I guess you're up next, Vanessa.
No, gosh, I'll just dig through the
Vanessa,
memory
you got to
banks.
go.
Yeah.
There's not been enough Vanessa yet.
This is great. The Galatian quote. It's actually fantastic, and I need to store it. I'm gonna exchange it for the Talmudic idea about disagreement. Do you know the Talmudic concept of argument for the sake of heaven?
No.
So of course, the Talmud will have a notion of the argument, the good kind of argument, right? Argument for the sake of heaven. Is the entire Talmud, despite the way that Candace Owens would depict it, that the entire Talmud is in fact a very fascinating legalistic record of different schools of thought arguing with each other about how to interpret the law. That is the nature of the Talmud, is different perspectives, total disagreements about epistemology, about ontology, theology, and legality, primarily legality. And in it, there is the two greatest schools of thought are the Hillel and the Shammai. The Hillels are the living constitution, Bader Ginsburg rights, and the Shammai is Scalia originalism.
So I'm Shammai, is what you're saying.
You're Shammai, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Originalist Shammai, and they are fascinating in how they, there are many threads of how they develop their different theories. By the way, just a side story in the side story, just because you're Shammai, you should know this. One of the best stories, because Shammai is very originalist, and he's very much puts in disfavor the oral tradition of the law. He thinks that the Jews need to adjudicate the law. There's a room for adjudication, but it has to be as textualist as possible, right? That's Shammai.
Mm-hmm.
And Hillel, because he's more of a living constitution, believes that the oral law plays a much bigger role in interpretation and adjusting the Torah to modern day.
Some of that also sounds Catholic versus Protestant.
There is a bit of
Catholic.
that. There's a bit of that too.
Because there's the magisterium and the anyway, go ahead.
Right, but both of them are actually well I'm not going to take that, but politically they're much more legalistic, both of them. But the Shammai, there's a story about a student who goes in the Talmud. There's a story about a student who goes to Shammai and Hillel, and he says he goes to Shammai, who doesn't like the oral law, and he says, I'm a young student, and I really love that how much you don't like the oral law, so I just want to learn the Torah itself. Just teach me the Torah itself. I heard that you're the school that only cares about the Torah itself. And Shammai was like, screw you. You're lazy. I don't care. Like you don't want to study oral law because you're lazy. I don't want to teach you. So the student goes to Hillel and is like, do you mind teaching me the Torah without the oral law? And Shammai says, well, yes, because I have the opportunity to convince you that the oral law is important. So it's wonderful. But all that, those two schools, they're philosophical, they're interesting, but they also sometimes killed each other, right? As schools of thought do. So there was violence. It's not like they were all peaceful.
Yeah.
But their fundamental difference exists in the Talmud, and the Talmud had to deal with this question of how do you define what constitutes legitimate disagreement, and at what point is it a worthy argument to have and preserve. And there's a statement that says an argument for the sake of heaven will forever be preserved, meaning that this is not an argument that we need to have a definitive answer for. In defense of uncertain things, the conflict itself between when the argument is for the sake of heaven is worthy. And what is a worthy argument? The Talmud asks, and the answer is between Hillel and Shammai. That's a worthy for the sake of heaven argument, meaning that this argument needs to forever exist. We need, different times we'll have different preferences about which side wins, whether it's the originalists or the living constitutionalists. But the very fact that that this argument is preserved maintains the fabric of society and allows it to both keep some traditional aspects and nature and longevity, but also evolve as the times require. And then the Talmud adds...
It creates, sounds like you're talking about creating a dialectic.
A dialectic, exactly. I intentionally did not use that word because of the anachronism of it, and I did not want to use Soviet thinking into my precious Talmud.
Hegelian.
Yeah. But then, it asks also, what is an argument that is not for the sake of heaven? And the answer is the Korach. I don't know how you say it in English. Korach and Adatok. The Korach and his company. The usurpers, Moses' usurpers, the people who try to bring a different interpretation into the people of Israel in the desert in order to usurp Moses. In other words, if your argument is there in order to usurp power, in order to assert yourself, and that's the source of your conflict, not because you're truly trying to get at the truth, that is illegitimate. And I thought that this is that's such a fascinating reflection. And this is part of what I see as the pseudo-theological tendencies that are happening now in the U.S., where the some of the neo-Catholic trad fervor seems to me a lot less about a presentation of a true argument for the sake of heavens than an attempt to usurp power under the guise of identity religion. And when I see Jack Posobiec waving his rosary while saying that, saying where in the Bible does it say that you need to read the Bible, I really doubt that this view is for the sake of heaven, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think that construct I think is very, very, very helpful, and it actually fits in many ways within the Galatians context that I was talking about. So I would say an argument for the sake of heaven is one that is going to be characterized by the fruit of the Spirit that you see in Galatians 5. I would say that the will to power and the argument for domination is going to be characterized by the kind of conduct that you see also in Galatians 5 when you talk about factions, dissension, rage. And so here's the way I've come to think of it. If you want to know where God is, look for virtue first and theology second, okay? Because why? Why would I say that? Because actually in Scripture, that's where God goes. He talks about the people who follow him consistently. How are they marked? Humility, compassion, the fruit of the Spirit as outlined in Galatians 5. The people who hate God might be among the foremost theologians around, but they are characterized by vice. And so, one of the mistakes that I think a lot of Christians make, because, in this country, which has got, especially if you come from where I came from in Nashville, it's not the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. It's the Jerusalem of American Christianity. There's a church on every street corner. That's only a slight exaggeration. Go down some streets and it's more than a church every street corner. And so a lot of people are like,
what's
how
the
do I choose
church to gun ratio in?
1 to 1. No. So there's a lot of conversations in Christian circles about finding and choosing a church, and 90% of it is dominated by theology. What do they believe? I think we're getting that backwards. It should be dominated by virtue. How do they act? Because the Bible tells us that the marker of God's presence is in your virtue. In the New Testament, it says, even the demons believe and shudder. The demons know theology. Satan knows theology. So theology isn't the marker. The marker is virtue. And to the extent that your theology is leading you away from virtue, you need to start thinking about your theology. But the problem that you often have is people get in love with their theology and despise virtue if it stands in the way of accomplishing their aims. So this is what you see in politics all the time, for example. People look back at old school Republicans who were more decent and even keeled or solicitous or compassionate in their public speech, and they're called losers. You are weak. You're a loser. And so a lot of what we see now is that, as a friend of mine used to say, assholes for Jesus are assholes. And a lot of these fundamentalists say assholes for Jesus are the real believers.
Assholes for Jesus are winners.
They're the winners. Yeah, they're the winners.
David, do you see virtue in politics at all? Do you have like your virtue antenna out, and is it buzzing anywhere?
Is it even possible?
Always have my virtue antenna out, including for myself, because
Right.
you have to. I'm not a perfect person, and so that what I just read in Galatians 5 is a high bar for any person, and so I try to have my virtue antenna out for myself, but I have it out for politics all the time. And let me just say, it's pinging less and less and less.
Mm-hmm.
If you had talked to me 15 years ago, and you had come to me and you'd said, politicians are snakes, they're terrible, they're just self-interested, they're greedy, they're, whatever, I would have said, yeah, some are, just like many lawyers are greedy, or many doctors are greedy, or many, but you would be surprised. You might be surprised if you get in a room with a lot of politicians, like how decent they are and how many of them are genuinely trying to do their best. That's a diminishing number. And part of the reason is the ferocious fundamentalist spirit of the age drives those people out. Life for them becomes very difficult.
I have to ask, do you think that there's a chance that your initial impression was wrong, that you were maybe a little more naive about politics, and maybe, we live now in a social environment that encourages everybody to express their dumbest thoughts, so you just get to see how shallow and vicious most people are? But
so I did the reverse. So in my 20s, I would have said politicians are snakes. In my 40s, by the time that I had gotten to know a lot more, many more politicians, I'd have been like, that was a simplistic and foolish thing to think in my youth. But then
and
what
now
I've
your
seen
20-year-old is being vindicated.
But then I've seen an actual change in the culture. So I don't think you said, so for example, is there institutions change and evolve in such a way that they're not always the same thing. Now, some institutions have a pretty constant culture, like say the Russian army, whether it was under the Tsars or the Soviets or Putin, is a pretty vicious and brutal thing, right? Other institutions and nations have changed dramatically, and the culture and the temperament and the ideologies of them change. And I have seen a change in politics and people who have been there for a while. Not long ago, I was talking to a senator who'd been in office pre-Trump era. And I asked this about a lot of politics. This is not a one-off conversation I have. I have this conversation all the time with long-standing politicians who've been in office for a long time. And I say, my perception is that we are more vicious, more partisan, more angry, more, that the culture of American politics has degraded. But there are people who tell me I'm naive, that the culture of American politics has always been tough. There's always been this politics ain't beanbag saying. Heck, going back to the founding era, we had a vice president of the United States kill a former Treasury secretary. They made a musical about it, right? I mean, we had a civil war. And so people say, isn't this just politics? And again and again and again and again, I get the exact same answer without variation. It's worse. It's worse. And so I think undeniably politics is a kind of profession where people are tempted to be dirty and corrupt, as is every profession where large sums of money are at stake or large amounts of power are at stake. So there's a constant temptation to be dirty and corrupt. But I do not believe politics is inherently more dirty or corrupt than, say, law or commerce or war, military service, etc. But I do think the culture of politics in America has degraded substantially as it's become more fundamentalist.
So for the politicians who are using religion to signal something, what are they signaling exactly? Because it seems clear that it isn't virtue. So what are they trying to communicate, do you think?
Can I be super cynical?
Sure.
Let me use a potentially apocryphal French revolutionary quote. There go the people, I must follow them, for I am their leader. I think that a lot of what is happening in this hyper-fundamentalist age is you are signaling to an in-group. I am one of you. I am your representative. I am your warrior. I am your guardian. And so that's why, for example, you have this phenomenon where lots and lots and lots of Republican politicians in particular view themselves as very masculine people and very bold and very strong while doing every darn thing Donald Trump tells them to do without having any independent will politically outside of Donald Trump. Why? Because their role is to be a guardian, a warrior, and a protector of their people. And Donald Trump is the general, and they might be a major or a captain. And we never say that like a major and a captain is in the army isn't courageous when they carry out the orders of their general. They see themselves as on a side, and that their job is to represent and be a warrior for their side. And in that circumstance, conversation, dialogue, compromise, all of those things are dirty words. All of those things are signs of cowardice, of weakness, of lack of conviction. And so what you really have to do is you have to penetrate this absolute sense of burning certainty and conviction that says, I am completely right and you are completely wrong. That's why I feel like humility is actually the seed from which national renewal will sprout, is more so than winning any election, and certainly more so than any effort towards domination.
Is there there's a part of me that always wonders how much commitment to kitsch, to an ersatz ideology, how quickly that can become a real belief in it. Right now, reflected somewhat in J.D. Vance and some of the Catholic reawakening, and certainly it's not absent in parts of the Protestant world, Protestant American and evangelicals. But there is a language that feels that at least play acts a craving for some kind of cultural crusade. There is a crusadery energy where we are here to dominate the enemies, and so much of this is part of what made me want to talk to you. That so much of the political conflict that until now was wrapped as culture war now is getting infused with this ersatz religiosity. But at some point, that injection of signaling can become the thing in itself, can't it?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Well, and a lot of the, I remember, I'm sure you remember this, Adam, from Dispatch days, but remember Madison Cawthorn he was this Republican congressman from North Carolina, and he openly admitted that he spent more money on comms than he spent on his policy shop. And everyone was like, what? Well, you're just saying the quiet part out loud. It's more important to you to signal than to govern, right? And Sarah said he's responding to the incentive of the age. That the incentive of the age, what is it that makes you a successful member of Congress now? Fame. It's not governance, it's fame. And so, in that way, signaling and arguing and provoking is a fundamental part of your job description in that kind of construct. Whereas the traditional job description or the traditional notion of influence in Washington for a member of Congress used to be paying your dues and becoming a chairman of a powerful committee. Well, now very few people know like who's chair of House Ways and Means, but everybody knew who Marjorie Taylor Greene was, even when she'd been stripped of her committee memberships, even when she had almost no formal power in Congress. Similar with the Squad. The Squad was a signaling group. They were a backbench. They had almost no power in the Democratic caucus. They had a lot of power in the court of public opinion. And so that signaling, it's all about I'm with you. I'm your champion. I'm with you. Not I'm leading you.
Right.
I'm with you. Those are two very different things.
But at what point does play acting at what point when signaling is so much about crusading against your religious opponents, at what point does signaling and performance become things that people should worry about, that religious minorities should start worrying about, that political enemies should start worrying about?
No, religious minority, well, let me put it this way. Out groups always need to be worried when in groups veer towards fundamentalism. It's just, no matter the institution, whether it's Harvard or the First Baptist Church in Mobile, Alabama, that's when, if you're an out group, fundamentalism is your enemy. Fundamentalism will destroy your life. And, it's interesting. I remember when I was a young 1L at Harvard Law School in 1991. So let's go way back. Nobody ever heard of the term woke then. We called it political correctness. But everything from the woke era existed in 1991 at Harvard. Shoutdowns. I mean, there's more shoutdowns then than there are now. There was cancel culture. There was hyper focus on identity, etc. And I'll never forget, like my first week or so there, I'm literally booed and shouted down in class. And then all of a sudden something clicked in my mind. I was like, oh, I know what I'm dealing with. It's fundamentalism. And how could I spot it? Because I grew up in a fundamentalist tradition. I grew up and I saw the exact same mindset in my secular, very, very progressive classmates that I saw in my highly religious, very, very conservative deacons, for example. The unwillingness to listen to dissent, an absolute conviction that you're right and the other side is wrong, the sense that another person's speech or expression in disagreement is a threat and has to be suppressed rather than an opportunity for persuasion in which you eagerly engage. And so I saw all of that. And so I think the people who are able to recognize fundamentalism first are always the out group. And I have come to the conclusion that one of my big blind spots, the reason why I did not see Trump coming, is I did not read enough critique of Republican evangelicalism from non-Republican non-evangelicals. In other words, I didn't read enough critique from the out group. I only tended to believe critique that I would read from trusted members of the in group. But they didn't have the same insights because they had not been punished and they had not been treated in the same way that members of the out group had been treated. And so like when I talk about just the horrific way a lot of evangelicals have treated my family, again and again, I'll hear people say, yeah, try being gay in the evangelical church in 1993.
Right.
Well, an LGBT critic of the a liberal LGBT critic of evangelicalism in 93, to my shame, is not the person that I was necessarily reading in 93 to get insight on my community. But I also think that I have come, and as I've grown up and hopefully older and hopefully wiser, definitely older, maybe wiser, uh, what I've realized is it's the outgroup who sees the claws, and it's the outgroup who experience the fangs. You really can only judge the virtue of any community until you know how they treat the outgroup.
So I have a final question that is a bit of a personal one in that I have a young teen nephew who has become, this is news to you, Adam. He's become very interested in Christianity at a time where it's a little bit fraught to do so. I don't know if you feel this. I mean, maybe I'm just feeling this as a non-religious person, but seeing the energy around Christianity among young men on social media, it has a bit of a tone, I guess, that feels a little fraught. So I was just curious, like, what would your advice be to someone who is interested in Christianity for, I believe, the right reasons, about how to explore it
Yeah,
now at this moment?
that is a great, great question because this is a perilous moment because there are many, many voices who are leading, in particular, young men astray. Um, they're looking at the genuine challenges that so many young men are facing and just replacing sort of any kind of sense of masculine virtue with kind of a Machiavellian will to power ethic, will to power, will to success,
Yeah, that
etc.
masculine undercurrent is so tricky. So tricky.
Very tricky. So, so the some of the best guidance that I could give him, and this is going to sound nerdy and weird, but let's go for it. Read Kierkegaard. Okay, and here's why. Okay, here's
Okay.
why. So Kierkegaard is coming of age at a time period where there was an established religion, and one of his best works is called Against Christendom, where he's able to see a lot of the flaws and problems of institutional Christianity. But at the same time, he doesn't throw the Christian baby out with the bathwater. But what he does illustrate and what he does show to young men, to young women, to people of all ages is the true path of Christianity is a hard path. It is often a lonely path, but it is a path marked by radical love of other human beings. It is and so my view of that is one of the great things, and this is for the intellectually curious. I'm not going to tell like everybody to read Kierkegaard because it's dense, it's hard. But like if you're a young man up for a challenge, up for an intellectual / theological challenge, so the reason why I say that is because Kierkegaard is like taking a vaccine against will to power. It's like injecting yourself with an mRNA vaccine against Machiavellianism, against Andrew Tateism, against Trumpism, against fundamentalism. Because what it does, and to such an extent that unless you kind of have encouraging people around you, it can feel quite daunting, the high moral call that is placed upon you as a Christian person. And it is daunting. I mean, Christ says, take up your cross, right? And so, but I think Kierkegaard, and short of Kierkegaard, that's for the super intellectually curious. Let me give him C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity.
Mm.
Read Mere Christianity. Read the Screw Tape Letters. They're very accessible. They're very easily readable. So Kierkegaard is for the young man who is, he's like, I've read Plato, I've read Aristotle, I'm ready, bring it on. Okay. That's for, but if you're just a regular person, regular folks who have not read their Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli and Hobbes and all of that, don't find that interesting. C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, Screw Tape Letters. It's so, those are in many ways, if you read them and you absorb them, they are like taking a vaccine against fundamentalism.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I'll read them
Yeah.
myself too. Maybe we'll read them together.
Well, that's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Oh, you won't regret it. Especially Screw Tape Letters is a delight. It's an absolute delight. It's letters between two demons who are trying to tempt an Englishman in World War II into hell.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going back and forth
What is it,
about
like cigars and brandy? What is it?
Well, it's everything. It's everything. And it's like how you can corrupt a Christian with nationalism, how you can corrupt a Christian with all of these and what they talk about is Christianity and once you add the and, pretty soon the and becomes more than the Christianity. And then that has a dovetail with mere Christianity, which is Christianity without the and. And so, people ask me, shorthand, I've described myself as an evangelical, and I'm still evangelical. But if you really want to press me and say, like, what kind of Christian are you? I would say, is there such a thing as a C.S. Lewisian Christian? C.S. Lewin with Tolkien flavors? Those are, but
We'll
that's
appreciate
getting
that
deep.
I named my son Caspian, not necessarily in honor of C.S. Lewis, but just because it was a fun name.
So
and I
two
like
things.
Lewis.
Glorious book, amazing name. That is
that
is an amazing name. I love that name.
Thank you.
Caspian is not the name. The book is probably one of the where I start departing from C.S. Lewis morality. Like there's an element there of seek and you shall find, and at the expense of screw those who haven't sought, and that always bothered me. It was like more. There was something.
Have you read The Last Battle?
No, I haven't. I haven't gotten there.
Oh, well then, that's an incomplete thought.
Okay, fair.
To be continued.
To be continued. That's an incomplete thought. It's like opining on Lord of the Rings after 60% of the way through Fellowship.
Did you read Till We Have Faces? By the way,
5 or 6 times. Yeah.
What do you think?
It's not my favorite, Lewis. I went through a period where though a lot of people just swear by it. But I went through a phase where I read about 8 or 9 books of Lewis on like almost on a rotation. And that made it into the rotation. But for Lewis, my favorites are the Space Trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandria, and That Hideous Strength, Mere Christianity, The Great Divorce, amazing. And then all the Narnia books. So I cannot wait to introduce the grandkids to the Narnia books.
I will say that Till We Have Faces touches the theme that I find increasingly fascinating in the past 5 years of resentment, and do you know Ruth Weiss? And this is the last thing we'll touch on. Do you know the scholar Ruth Weiss, Jewish scholar?
Yes, I'm not much. Okay. Not well.
So I interviewed her recently, and we got into a discussion about the 10th commandment, that thou shalt not covet. And always that has been my biggest issue with the 10th commandment. That was the commandment that I never got, because for me Judaism has always been about the actions and not the thought crimes. Thought crimes is more of you guys. You care about the soul and the spirit and the mind, whereas in Judaism it is about how to interpret the action. That's how I always read that distinction. And yet here, 10th commandment is about a thought crime. And I found what she helped me see is that this is indeed a thought crime, but this is the one thought that Judaism attributes all or much of evil actions to. When you are covetous, when you have that resentful envy, where you're not just satisfied by you're not just would like to have things that you don't at the moment, but rather angry at somebody else for having the thing that you believe you deserve to have. That is a source of evil, and I think that is something that Till We Have Faces deals with profoundly.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because we don't talk enough about envy and covetousness. It was only recently before I learned the link between envy and that sort of concept of the evil eye. Mm-hmm. The evil eye and envy are connected to each other. And
I don't think I knew that.
It's a very interesting that the evil eye is the envious eye in many ways, and that a lot of our maladies, and in many ways, one of the things that our culture has done is elevated sort of envy and covetousness to a kind of virtue. Because it's our envy, it's our covetousness that drives our economic activity, and it drives, it's the old Gordon Gekko, greed is good, And so I think we don't appreciate enough how much envy decays the soul and motivates these actions. So I do think that actually, honestly, Adam, you're quite familiar because you and I have talked about this a lot over the years. All of the fighting in the conservative world between pundits and politicians, it's all cast as, well, I disagree with you. But a lot of it is actually, I want what you have, so I'm going to tear you down. A lot of it is about the pecking order, much more than it's about the superiority in any given sense of ideas. And so once you recognize and once you see that, you're actually able to see the world much more clearly.
David, thank you so much. I've said
Thank
this
you.
many times. As far as I see it, you're the soul of a dying nation. So
Well, I thank you, Adam, but man, that's bleak. That is bleak.
Well, a renaissance is always possible, is always on the offing.
Yes,
Thank you, David.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you both. Really enjoyed it.